when I saw Magnolia as an 18-year-old, where I just kind of thought it sucked.
Maybe you should just look the other way.
To introduce you to our audiences, Adam Nayman is a critic, an author, my neighbor, my friend, my colleague, brother in arms when we're deciding to fight on behalf of Paul Thomas Anderson to win whatever prizes at the Toronto Film Critics Association Awards. And he just wrote this big monumental book that I consumed last night. It's called Paul Thomas Anderson Masterworks. Beautiful deep dive into each and every one of Paul Thomas Anderson's films. Adam, I mean, we're going to talk about Magnolia today. That's going to be our focus. But like before we get into that, I think we should point out, like, you call the book Masterworks, and I think it's in the book. You say it like the Masterworks is the latter point, the latter stuff in Paul Thomas Anderson's career. Like that. I mean, I think me and you have discussed before in the past. Like our favorites are I mean, specifically the last three: The Master, Inherent Vice, and Phantom Thread, with There Will Be Blood being the kind of a major stepping stone to that level, to those films. Would you agree with that? Are we both on the same page there?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, the title was chosen by myself and the publisher to have a couple of meanings, because obviously it has to do also with the idea of work, meaning process and collaboration. So if you proceed from the premise that he's a kind of master filmmaker, which I think at this point, even his detractors would probably argue that there's masterful elements to the way this guy makes movies, just on the level of craft, technique, composition. I mean, how does he work, right? And that's where a lot of the interviews with his big collaborators come from, which is not just about how they work for him, but just how they work in and on their own terms, whether it's a cinematographer like Robert Elswit or an editor like Dylan Titchener. But I would also agree with you that the idea of a masterwork is something that I think applies subjectively for me to some of his later movies, but it's something that he's tried to make from the beginning, right? Mm-hmm. This is not a filmmaker who has a sort of I'll try it and see it how it goes sensibility. I mean, we talk about this all the time. There's all kinds of careers. And sometimes you have a filmmaker like, let's just say Steven Soderbergh, who was one generation earlier than Anderson as a kind of, this guy's a hope for American independent cinema. And Soderbergh has chosen to just try one thing after another, after another, after another. And while he's a bit of a perfectionist in terms of editing, the movies are clearly uneven. And some of them are designed to be light and throwaway. Like there's a big difference between a 4-hour movie like Che and a tossed off movie like Side Effects or, almost a filmed play like High Flying Bird. Anderson from the beginning has tried to make these dense, elaborate, fully realized works. Even something like Punch Drunk Love, which is an Adam Sandler romantic comedy, is incredibly fussed over. And so, I think one of the things the book is about is this is a guy who has been influenced by and inspired to create masterworks from the beginning. For me, he hasn't always gotten there, but there are times when that talent has been realized. And I think that when it all works together, he's a pretty formidable American filmmaker, not just in his moment, but I think against almost any measuring stick you want to throw at him.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, he's definitely my favorite filmmaker working today. And The Master is probably my favorite movie of the 21st century. And it's interesting. I feel like you kind of switched up in the process of writing this book. The Master was your favorite. And I think when in the introduction of this book, Phantom Thread has supplanted that.
I mean, I think I have a little bit more affection for Phantom Thread because there's things about its storyline just having to do with maybe aging and marriage and its view of kind of domestic comedy. I have a huge amount of affection for. But I mean, as you implied, I think The Master as an exercise in technique and storytelling, and as a movie that accesses certain things about American cultural history, I think it's pretty peerless. Mm-hmm. I think Phantom Thread is extremely likable, and I don't think The Master's slightly lower level of likability compromises it in any way. I mean, we're on the same page with that film. Mm-hmm. And I tried in this book to do right by the movies of his that I think are really great, but also to do right by the movies of his that both earlier in my life and now are maybe not masterworks, even as they try to be. But even if they are not masterworks, they are tremendously interesting. And for me, the movie we're going to talk about today is in that is in that category. Though it wasn't when I saw Magnolia as an 18-year-old, where I just kind of thought it sucked.
That's interesting because like I'm on the page. I mean, first of all, we should acknowledge that I think for a lot of people, Magnolia is his best film. A lot of people assume say that like more often than not.
Yep, absolutely. There's no question that there's a group of a number of people for whom, and not just maybe it's best film, but like it's a very important movie in their viewership or their development. And like we're around the same age. I think I'm a bit older than you. I'm 39, same age. So you remember when that came out, it was like this is big hype, right? Like not the same hype of like The Matrix in the same year, but it was a hype. It was like, here is the grown-up movie of the year. And that's a big target to put on a movie's back,
I don't know. Okay, so my memory of it. So I mean, we were both 18. I had just turned 18. I'm a December baby. I think your birthday's way earlier.
April, yeah.
Yeah. So I first of all, for me, it's a trek from Scarborough to the Paramount Theater, which is now the Scotiabank Theater. It was called the Paramount Theater back then. That's where it was playing. And also, like my experience of it was colored by right after the frogs, like right near in the climax, the reel jammed and burned up. So it's like the last 1 minute of the movie was left. Like I did not like we had to like sit there and wait for them to fix it so we could catch the last minute of the movie. But my memory of it is this movie that all of a sudden got all this critical praise. I think it was Jeff Pavir that gave it 5 stars in the Toronto Star, and that's what made me rush downtown to see it, because I never even heard of it up until that point, right? Because at that point I had no access to the film festivals and I had no access to any of what was going on, so I only knew what I could read in the Toronto Star. So this is a movie, that year was all American Beauty. That was what everyone was talking about. It was American Beauty. And then Magnolia kind of snuck in at the end and got special praise from the Toronto film critics, as far as I remember it. But I didn't remember it taking off elsewhere. But that's, again, from my own little bubble.
Funny that both of those movies are named after flowers. You have American Beauty and Magnolia as these kind of... And they're very different regional portraits, right? Because American Beauty is sort of an East Coast suburb. It's certainly not, it's an Eastern Standard Time movie. And they're both kind of these platitudinous movies where whether you're cutting them into a trailer or describing them to friends, they're these movies of kind of show-stopping dialogue moments and exchanges, and they're both reaching to the 70s. Like we should say that, and this has been covered a lot, especially last year when all these websites were doing their anniversary pieces on the year, but like 1999 just felt really paradigmatic. And that's maybe something that's been overplayed in recent years. But I remember being an 18-year-old film goer. And again, I think our experiences of teenage cinephilia were different based on location and whatever else. But I just remember in 99 feeling like, oh, this is what they talked about in the 70s, where every week or every month, there's something worth arguing about or writing about. And I don't think I came to that conclusion on my own. I came to that conclusion because all the 70s vintage film critics, including a guy like Jeff, were making those allusions in their reviews. So when Fight Club came out, people were like, oh, this is like A Clockwork Orange, not just because it is derivative of A Clockwork Orange, but because it's like, is this subversive? Is this shallow? Is this exploitative? Or Three Kings came out. And it's like, oh, it's like the anti-Vietnam movies, except it's a Gulf War movie. And is it even anti-war? It's pretty kind of, ambivalent. So Magnolia, I think for a lot of people our age, maybe not me because I was obsessive already and had started checking these movies out, but the whole thing with Magnolia was like, here's Robert Altman, and here's the cinema of the 70s, and here's this sprawling ensemble portrait of America like Nashville or something, or more like Shortcuts, which he ripped off in the 90s. Yeah. But that's what the stakes felt like, I think that when we all went to see The Matrix, maybe the stakes were lower, which was just like, that shit's cool, But I think that
came like everyone was waiting for Star Wars, and it was like Matrix was filling the time, and had to be like
and kicked Star Wars ass on every level, especially in terms of that really weird word of likability.
Mhm.
You know, like you can't, whatever you think of the series as it went on, you watch the first Matrix and you're like, this is what I want to see in a movie.
Yeah.
It's really fun. But I think that with American Beauty, Magnolia, Fight Club, Being John Malkovich, Eyes Wide Shut, there it felt like something was at stake. And it's very significant, I think, that in '99 you have Tom Cruise sort of in the posthumous Kubrick movie, which of course was hugely misunderstood and
Mhm.
was way better than people thought it was. But he's like presiding over the death of the Ur 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s master auteur. And then he's kind of showing up quite surprisingly in PTA's movie. And the kind of both movies playing a guy who's all about getting laid, which we can talk about later. But it's like and I think that Cruise was the X factor in terms of Magnolia going from maybe what Boogie Nights was, which was a festival movie with a bit of mainstream appeal,
Mhm.
into this thing that like opened in 2000 theaters and kind of was positioned as a hit. It didn't become one, but
Mhm.
they were hoping this was going to be their big Christmas '99 hit for New Line, which it wasn't.
There's so many things now that you mentioned in that like that we need to go back to. I mean, the
Yes, sir.
99 era, the Eyes Wide Shut, all these things. I mean, I should also admit, like, first off, like when Magnolia came out, I loved the shit out of Magnolia.
Right.
And I that was my favorite movie that year. I remember I was rooting for it for the Oscars, and it was only like as I felt like as I aged, I saw the the bloat of it, and I saw how like yes, like the bloat of it, and how a lot of the artistry and kind of meaning is tacked on to showmanship versus the other way around. And also, I mean, I feel like I only appreciated that stuff as PTA himself matured as a filmmaker, and I saw, oh no, this is what great filmmaking is, as opposed to Magnolia, right? But I mean, I'm looking at Magnolia. First of all, I still have a lot of love for Magnolia. I mean, that movie has all the feels. I still love it. It's got a technical. There's the technical mastery of it. But also now, when I'm reading your book, when I'm reading your chapter on it, I got like this new appreciation for Magnolia in terms of how it would hit today, both its flaws and its strengths.
Right.
Especially when you're talking about a movie about isolation and a movie about like kind of feeling like you're on the brink of catastrophe, and on a movie about like all of these emotions that Magnolia packs. It's like I mean, have you considered how it would hit, like how it would affect people if they revisit that today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that a lot of those and we'll narrow into Magnolia, but it's just context is so interesting, and it's like if you look at those '99 movies, there's a real sense of on the verge, right?
Mm.
The Matrix is on the verge of like, what if the world becomes digital? I mean, I'm simplifying it, right? But like the Desert of the Rio and the Baudrillardian simulation and Fight Club, which I think even more, which is a movie that I didn't like and still have issues with. I actually watched it yesterday. Still have issues with, but I mean, it was correct about certain things, and not because male violence and incel culture got invented yesterday and Fight Club saw it coming, but it touched something universal that at the time seemed excessive, but its moment has kind of come in terms of the internet. And with Magnolia, I think that movie was it's such a Y2K movie, whether he meant it or not. It's like something's coming, we all have these lives and they're haunted by the past, and people are fucking up in the present, and there's not enough time to be forgiven before something is going to happen. And in the big Hail Mary that Anderson throws, it's apocalyptic, but it's also regenerative when the frogs come, and it's an ending for characters, but for the most part it's kind of a new beginning, right? It's this thing that shocks everybody into a sense of individual awareness, but it's a collective event. And I think that that's what people were really kind of fantasizing about and wondering about. And the fact that Magnolia was never, I think, originally written to go that way, but found its way to that kind of structure is it's obviously on Paul Thomas Anderson's mind. Whatever else is on that guy's mind when he's 27 and, being heralded as the Great White Hope. And I think that there's an honest sense of anticipation and uncertainty, which is juxtaposed against not dishonest, but a pretty self-conscious sense of like, I got to make the great American movie. Because if I'm the great American filmmaker, maybe, which Hard Eight and Boogie Nights made some people think he was, and he in his own mind has never lacked for that ambition and hubris, and he gets Final Cut, which is like the Orson Welles holy grail of like they're going to let me make the movie I want. And then I'm not personally speculating, but cocaine and all that other stuff. That's where the movie doesn't just feel like it's anticipating the future. It's like, I got to get everything that's ever happened in the whole of human experience into this movie. And even if it's still contained within Los Angeles and a couple square blocks of the San Fernando Valley, and even if in some ways it's a pretty narrow movie in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of experience, he's like, you write what you know, I'm going to write it all and put it in this movie. And I think that that's where both the affection for it for a lot of people, including myself in places, comes, but also like that's where you kind of have the movie dead to rights, which is it has shape, but the shape, as you say, is like it's desperately overstuffed. And the fact that he's able to shape it as smartly as he can is technique, but it's not natural.
Right.
And just there's a lot of shit in the movie that I think is just kind of shit.
Well, I mean, you kind of hit on it. I mean, on one thing, like the race factor, right? Like at the time, nobody cared that the two black characters were kind of just like there to be truth, or the 2 or 3 black characters. Sorry?
Yeah, they're truth tellers.
Yeah, the truth
right?
tellers, exactly. They're just there to like bring the white people to account and then disappear, so to speak, right? But yeah, but again, like, do you think people would even notice that? I mean, I think now we're in this era now where people are more attentive and receptive to these things, right? I wonder if even last year anyone would have cared that the black characters in Magnolia were so dispensable.
Well, I think that even at the time, I mean, 1999 is not exactly the dark ages. This was something that was mentioned. It's often mentioned in movies about Los Angeles where, and La La Land took this right on the chin, right? Where you have this almost pathologically deracinated city, which is both, it's like a Hollywood tradition that Hollywood has always been as an industry kind of focused on promoting and centering certain experiences and stars and couplings. And, it's why whenever people say, well, don't you have any movies by a black filmmaker on this list? It's always in contrast to what you would expect the list to be made up of, right? No one is ever like, hey, do you have any white filmmakers on this list?
No.
It's always like, did you remember Charles Burnett? Did you get a Spike Lee on there? I mean, that, although he's a New York filmmaker.
Right.
But with Magnolia, I think again the writing workshop chestnut, write what you know. So what does Paul Thomas Anderson know? He grows up in Studio City in a showbiz family. I think that in Hard Eight and Boogie Nights and Magnolia, there is a clear effort to include black characters, but it's an effort to include the one, right? So in Hard Eight, you actually I think effectively have Samuel L. Jackson just as a pure villain in that movie, and you dare people into the idea that, here's this black character destabilizing these white characters, and it actually feels a lot less ass covering. It's just like, here's a good actor cast in an interesting part, and there's no significance beyond that because it's a very small little genre story.
Right. Yeah.
But in Boogie Nights, Don Cheadle is symbolizing a lone black character in this white milieu, and he tries to fit in by adopting these different aesthetics, like the cowboy, the black cowboy thing, which is really funny. And Cheadle's really funny too, but he's part of the ensemble, and he actually gets a full arc, right? But that's not who the movie's about.
Right.
And in Magnolia, I think that it's very telling that there was a whole plot line more about Dixon and his mom and this character, the Worm, who was played by Orlando Jones, which was still stereotypically weighted towards sort of the violent gangster element within the movie's world. I mean, it was never going to become a crime film, but it kind of was more in that direction. But then he just kind of cut it out. And so what's left is, the rapping kid who kind of mystically lays out the movie for you, and John C. Reilly kind of taunts him a bit like Cool It Coolio, all that stuff. And the interviewer for Tom Cruise, who, as you say, is there to kind of hold the white guy to account, this kind of strong black woman who kind of elicits stuff from him. I mean, when you lay out that degree of representation in those first 3 movies, in some ways you're like, well, that's more black characters than, David Fincher or Spike Jonze or Charlie Kaufman, but then this is a relativism game that you're playing. I think that if someone were to make, even look at a movie 5 years later, and no one compares these movies, though I think they're a good comparison and not a flattering one to Magnolia, but you have to make it. You look at not Don Cheadle, Paul Haggis. You look at Crash,
Oh yeah.
and he's trying to make a kind of Los Angeles mosaic. He's way more attentive to the idea, and I'm not praising him as an artist. I'm just saying he covered his ass as a liberal.
Right.
Way more attentive to the idea of diversity, right?
Well, I mean, when you make your movie about it.
Yeah, when you make your movie about it. And
right.
yet, you know, and he got Matt Dillon the Oscar nomination he deserved for about 10 other movies.
Right, yeah.
You know, for being a racist molesting cop.
But you understand that I'm more offended by Crash's take on race than I am.
Of course.
No,
Yeah.
I mean, like I would much rather the black characters, I guess, be the truth tellers of Magnolia rather than whatever the hell Ludacris is in that movie, where, you know, I mean, because they play into it like not even very convincing criminals. Like I remember I was horrified the carjacking scene where it's kind of like a joke, like it's played to comedic effect until it's not.
It's a horrific movie.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and when you go by, and again, it's not to diverge too much, but I mean, the thing about Magnolia 2 was New Line saw it as their Oscar movie, and it got some of that attention. I mean, Cruise was nominated, Julianne Moore was nominated, the script was nominated. But when you look at what it means to be an Oscar movie, it's a badge of dishonor. Like the movie from '99 that has aged the worst is American Beauty.
Mm-hmm.
Which is only redeemed in the sense that most prestige TV now is like American Beauty. So it's a disgrace as a movie, but it's also a kind of primal scene of what TV looks like, which is just kind of melodrama on shuffle. Right? I mean, you know, it's such a gutless movie. It's like, you know, what if a 60s boomer, you know, rebels? And it's like, well, he doesn't rebel at all. I mean, it doesn't even have the guts to have him, you know, want to sleep with the 16-year-old, because then it would violate how much we like him and care about him as a hero and as a dad. I think one of the things about Magnolia that holds up better, one of the things you got to give it on this level, and this is a thing that I think is true of Anderson overall, and maybe this will prompt something interesting to talk about or what you think about this, but he goes for it. And he's not actually going for something subversive in a sense of being offensive. That's never the kind of filmmaker he is. Boogie Nights is the closest he's come to a movie where it's like, oh man, I'm getting off on being kind of gross. Right. And that's fine because it's about porn. But Magnolia, you can look at it one way and say, oh God, what an embarrassing movie. It doesn't hold anything back. You can also be like, hey man, it doesn't hold anything back.
Yeah.
He, you know, whether he's got a lot to say, I don't know, but there's no filter or delete button. Yeah. It's not calculated like an American Beauty is, I think, to flatter the audience.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I always fall on the latter side, like, because that's why I still have love for Magnolia. I still like it. Still gives me the feels, even if I could look at it and be like, you know, I got your number, right? Like there's no mystery to it. But you know, like, and I want to go back to kind of the other thing you mentioned, the other movie you mentioned, Fight Club of this '99 era. Because if we're talking about these kind of, like, I think both Anderson, you and I agree, both Anderson and David Fincher are two master filmmakers working right now. Like, these are the guys that were like, I am hotly anticipating whatever they make. And also that both Fight Club and Magnolia are largely considered their best movies for a certain crowd. Meanwhile, they are far objectively not their best movies. I mean, this is not even an argument. Like, it's like they of course got better later. For Fincher, his best movie is Zodiac. For Paul Thomas Anderson, it's everything post There Will Be Blood. But I mean, that connection, the fact that they are both, like, the people love them for these two 99 movies that are very much about a certain type of masculinity. I mean, I want you to take the ball from there. Like, where do we even like begin there?
Yeah, I mean, they are about a certain kind of masculinity, and I think they hit aspects of a teenage viewership where those teenagers live. Mm-hmm. They also appealed to the eternal teenagers at heart that are most, you know, 30-something or middle-aged dudes. Mm-hmm. You know, it's funny because in writing a book about the Coens and in writing a book about PTA, you're trying to be as observant and rigorous and critical as possible, but you're also like, these are not under-discussed or underdeveloped filmmakers. And in a way, what you're doing is you're just putting bricks in the cathedral of auteurism. Mm-hmm. And while very few things are more tiring than like the Twitter tactic of like, here are 10 books that, if they're on a guy's shelf, look out, or here are 10 movies that if someone has the poster for, they're bad. You don't want to resemble that remark, because there is some truth to it. I mean, Fight Club is a dorm room poster kind of movie. It's a very like, don't hate the band, hate the fans proposition, because much like Clockwork Orange, I think it leaves room to be enjoyed for, and I'm using this word a bit sarcastically, but like the wrong reasons, right? There are no right or wrong reasons. Art is subjective, but Fight Club is a movie that doesn't just diagnose like insular, petty sexist masculinity. It kind of trains it. And even if the guys who made it are smarter than that, and with David Fincher, I'm not even sure. I mean, he's a smart guy, but there's echoes of that in his other work. So, it's like, do you trust the maker? Do you trust the film? And I think that with Magnolia, it's the same area, but a slightly different part of the coin, where in Fight Club, the anger and rage is expressed through violence and subversion. And Magnolia is kind of, and I'm using this phrase kind of, amusedly, but like, it's a sad boy movie, and the whole thing with Cruz's character is like, he's screaming, respect the cock, but it's about his flaccidity in the end. That's why it's a funny pair with Eyes Wide Shut. Like in Eyes Wide Shut, he can't get laid. In Magnolia, he demonstrably can. But it's really a movie that takes Tom Cruise to like his dad's bedside to weep and cry about, whether he loved him or not. I mean, Cruise's whole performance just kind of is a study in crumpling, right? That rigid, erect, Kubrickian 2001 Thus Spake Zarathustra thing is something that the movie demolishes and kind of reduces. So, and there's something very maybe sentimental about that. A lot of guys are like, I wish my dad loved me too. I mean, I'm not trying to be sarcastic. It's just that the movie is right on that razor's edge between like packaging something and I think really analyzing it. And it's very telling to me, obviously, and this is biographically well known, that Anderson wrote it after his own dad's battle with cancer, which doesn't mean you can't criticize the movie, but it does give it the personal dimension where, if you give a little bit of credit to the idea of autobiography or people trying to work something really personal out to them, I think it accounts maybe for the movie's lack of discipline. It's hard to censor those feelings,
Yeah, but the thing is, it's like both of those movies then are really prophetic for the audiences for the people we're seeing now and today.
Oh, yeah,
you mentioned the MRAs, right? Like, and I'm just wondering, like, I mean, the generation today that might discover this movie, or that might still hold this, like when you look at it in that context.
Well, I think Fight Club is still the more ethically ambivalent potential recruiting tool movie, because it yokes all that to an anti-corporate analysis that is pretty seductive when Brad Pitt is giving it to you.
Right.
That Pitt monologue about the middle children of history has not exactly gone out of date.
Right.
I mean, whether you buy it in the first place is different. And I think the whole point is it's meant to be counterintuitive, that Brad Pitt is telling a room full of dudes, you'll never be movie stars. And it's like, this is Brad Pitt looking probably more beautiful than any man has ever looked in a movie before or since. I mean, he just looks unbelievable in that film. I think that in Magnolia, there's much more of a kind of like, this guy is a salesman, this guy's a snake oil salesman, this guy's an asshole, this guy's got a fake name, and he's got a fake grift, and he's got a fake shtick, and we're going to unveil that fakery to get to the scared little boy inside. I mean, I think people might identify with that part of it, but that's not so much watching it now and being like, oh shit, this movie can do damage. I think it's more this movie was maybe a bit ahead of the curve in diagnosing how insidious in that one. Because again, there's a movie with like 15 plots that we can talk about. I mean, the Cruise plot is just one of them, but I think it's the one that people remember most. And I think that it's because Anderson has always yoked his own showmanship to these showman characters. So the big speech that Cruise gives at the beginning of Magnolia, and the big speech that Daniel Day-Lewis gives at the beginning of There Will Be Blood, and the various speeches that Philip Seymour Hoffman gives in The Master, they're all kind of coming from the same place. People who are acting like they have the answers. and the movies are suggesting there's something about America, both generally and specifically in the moments and places the movies take place, where people want to hear that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, you can take a deep breath and be like, oh, these are Trumpian portraits if you want. But I think that to do that is kind of zeitgeisty criticism and belays how specific the movies are in other ways.
Yeah.
But it's telling that that's the stuff that people remember most from Magnolia, because Cruise has this movie star charisma that in 1999 was its peak. That was like after Mission Impossible, after Jerry Maguire, pretty much peak Tom.
Right. But
thing.
When you talk about like the way, yes, there's the zeitgeist aspect of it, but both of these, Fight Club and Magnolia, they're both about this sort of sickness within masculinity. Now we call it toxic masculinity. I don't think we called it toxic masculinity in 99, right?
The terminology wasn't there.
Sure. Right? But it's all of Paul Thomas Anderson's movies is about a certain sickness with masculinity. They're all very critical, even his latter movies as well, right? But that's just the thing. It's like the sickness of masculinity. It's not just in the Tom Cruise character in Magnolia. It's across the board. It's even the John C. Reilly character is sort of trying to measure up to a certain masculinity and stuff like that, right? And so that's why it feels like very prophetic to me when I was reconsidering it.
No, it is, and it's and the flip side of that coin, which from a dramaturgical point of view can also get a bit boring, is sort of victimized women, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Yeah,
which is something that he kind of indulged in Hard Eight with the Gwyneth Paltrow character, where again, her being a kind of like call girl with a heart of gold is very genre specific, so you get away with it. But then in Boogie Nights, both what's most appealing and most sort of unconvincing about the movie is that porn shoots are a family, so Julianne Moore is mom because she can't be mom to her real kid, and Heather Graham is like a lost little girl, and you're sort of like, these cliches work maybe in the porn movies themselves. I don't know how much they work in the reality of the 1970s that you're trying to fashion. Mm-hmm. And I think that part of what's most egregious about Magnolia, it's not that the actors are bad. The actors are quite good. But the conception of the female characters in this movie about all kinds of lost men, old men, young men, gay men, straight men, adults, kids, the women exist at best in counterpoint, and at worst as afterthoughts. Mm-hmm. Afterthoughts who have these really, really abject moments that are so unflattering. But at the same time, the last shot of Melora Walters as an emblem for the movie, this kind of smiling through tears, is really quite beautiful. She's beautiful, and the shot is beautiful, and the shot is clearly composed with love. And, if you go by the premise that you don't think about how you would ever improve a movie, you just deal with what a movie is, you have to deal with this aspect of Magnolia. You're not going to change it. So what is it?
Yeah, it's interesting that Anderson's maturity as a filmmaker, as he kept growing, also shows an improvement in how he depicts female characters, especially when you start getting to The Master, Inherent Vice, and then Phantom Thread being the ultimate. Yeah. Finally, how taking on a female perspective.
Yeah, an improvement, or at least an increased interest. And I know people who would look at a movie like Phantom Thread and say something like, nice try, but, right? And that's fair enough.
Right.
I think that in Inherent Vice, having Joanna Newsom be the voice of the film is more of a literary device. It's a way to keep Pynchon's prose there. It's effective. I think that there's an interesting play with power in that movie when Catherine Waterston comes back, and you get all the kind of like juvenile wet dream fantasy stuff from Boogie Nights, but it's made quite acrid and awful when she comes back. I mean, that sex scene is really unpleasant. Mm-hmm. And it's not a teenage fantasy. It's like a really curdled teenage fantasy that's narrating to you that this is not how things work. So I think you're right that he becomes more critical of it. And yeah, I think Phantom Thread is hilarious as a movie that is all about how a woman sees Reynolds, both what seduces her about him and also what she just kind of sees through. I think that is evidence of artistic growth. I mean, whether it's fully successful is debatable. But I mean, if Anderson is anyone in Magnolia, I mean, he's the little kid, right?
Right.
He's the preternatural genius who at the end of a 3-hour movie is like, we should all be nice to each other. And I'm not trying to belittle the movie. I mean, you could look at the movie and say that's actually pretty powerful. You know, the children will lead. Out of the mouths of babes comes wisdom. It's like one of those morals that you don't want to disagree with it, because in a vacuum, saying you need to be nicer to me, Dad, is fair enough. I mean, I'm a dad. I want to be nicer to my kid, or I try to be nice to my kid. It's just a question, you know, like, do you hinge a millennial social cross section on that?
Right.
And if that's what your incredibly sophisticated cross-cutting and narrative subdividing and fourth wall breaking and Altman homaging comes to, you're like, is this enough?
Right.
Or do you conclude that it is, and it's more than a lot of movies have to say about social relations? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean, like that kind of nailed it on the head there. For all its decorations, it's as simple as that. And whether that's good enough for you or not, that dictates how much you care about this movie. And you said the magic word, and like you said Altman. I mean, you already referenced Shortcuts in Nashville, which is two movies. This movie, I mean, especially Shortcuts, but I would say Nashville as well. I mean, what I really loved about like your defense of Magnolia, which in your book, is that, you know, like this. Sorry, there's this one criticism. I'm going to take a step back here. There's this one criticism of Anderson's films that your friend Nick Pinkerton, a fellow critic, he pointed out that Anderson likes to he gets himself into a corner, and by the climax of his films, he writes his way out. He just gives you some kind of extravagant act, whether it's the frogs in Magnolia, the violence in Boogie Nights, or the violence even in There Will Be Blood. Even There Will Be Blood, I think the flaw of that movie is that it has to write itself out of that corner, right? That narrative corner. And I mean, he said it about The Master, but I don't think that actually applies to The Master. But so talking about how he writes himself out of these narrative corners, which absolutely, the frogs is absolutely that thing. But then you point out that, well, yeah, but so was the earthquake in Shortcuts. And so was, in a way, the assassination in Nashville, Nashville is one of my favorite movies of all time. So like, can't be that bad.
I mean, in some ways, Nashville is an incredibly sophisticated and layered movie that also comes to not a simplistic point, but a simple one. I mean, I'm going to say simple rather than simplistic, right? But, you know, it also took place in the middle of a decade where enough has happened in both directions. Like, it's about the first 200 years of America, but there's also the aftershocks of Nashville, particularly the assassination of John Lennon, where you sort of are like, wow, you know, this movie touched on something. And I don't know if Magnolia can compete with that, even though we've talked about some of its resonances, you know, later on. But I mean, fundamentally, movies are narratives, and choices are made about how we enter and exit and end those narratives. And I don't see anything less organic or more fundamentally dishonest about the kind of Hail Marys Anderson throws than the endings of those movies, particularly when it comes to the idea of an ensemble film, where, you know, and Anderson does something in Magnolia that I think is interesting. At the exact midpoint and at the ending, he contrives these devices to remind us that no one character is more important, and by extension, less important or less sympathetic, by having them all sing the Amy Mann song, which is, again, a moment that for some people is like the purest nails on a chalkboard emotionalism, where they're like, give me a fucking break. Like, why are you doing this? You're doing this because you can't dramatize these people on their own terms. So you have them all sing along to this sad ass indie rock song. And that's the case for the prosecution. And the case for the defense is like, you know, in a musical, there's collective expressions of longing and yearning and sadness. And this is one. And the movie is written, Anderson has said, you know, written to Amy Mann's songs. And so he's letting them take over. In a way, it's a female narrator, right? Even if she's being ventriloquized by the actors, they're all speaking Amy Mann's truth in that in that moment. And the ending is the same thing. It's a way to level out and place the characters on equal footing, even if it means that they're all kind of under attack. And I will say this, within the editing, I really do love the way, and it's really good filmmaking, where and Hoffman as Phil Parma, we haven't even talked about Philip Hoffman yet. I mean, we might not have to, but he asks the question like, why are there frogs falling from the sky? And then long after that, after this ecstasy of cross-cutting and different characters, Stanley Spector, the little Paul Thomas Anderson figure, is sitting there in the library. He goes, well, this is a thing that happens.
Mhm.
And I really like the way those two things answer each other, where even if it's a Hail Mary and even if it's inorganic, the way that it's realized cinematically has a certain kind of poetry to it. I mean, the Hoffman character is almost like a caricature or a vessel of just pure humane goodness, like a child who's become an adult. And the little boy hasn't become an adult yet, but he has a wisdom that kind of supersedes that. And I like the way that they speak to each other across the montage. And Anderson gives a very kind of Zen koan answer to his riddle. You know, why is this happening? Well, it happens. Which again is kind of, what do they say in Showgirls? Like t-shirt wisdom.
Yeah.
But in the middle of all the sound and fury and just cinematic, cinematic sophistication that he's able to deploy, it stands out and it kind of gives you that little shiver of poetry to it. And some people might want to vomit, but for others, it kind of gets there.
It's interesting. You say, yeah, because you repeat it happens. I mean, you repeat that a couple of times in your book, and I'm just trying to remember now. I may cut this portion out, but it's like when the abusive dad character, when I can't remember the actors' names right now.
Philip Baker.
Yeah, when he admits to the abuse, and the mom rushes over to the apartment. Is there a quick zoom cut to a painting that says it happened?
Yeah, there is in the little corner of the frame, and yeah, that's a pretty interesting moment in that it seems to be commenting that what he can't quite remember or what he can't quite say is true.
Yeah,
you know, that what he's talking around is something that it happened.
Yeah.
You know.
But it's an interesting thing where like Anderson comes in godlike to inscribe that into the narrative because he couldn't find any other way to say it or do that. And he couldn't, I mean, I think there's a cheat in that.
There is, and there's lots of those little things that I think are meant to create a connectivity and a texture, like all the 8-2 references, you know, which were all later in the artistic process, which is a way for him of kind of, you know, creating a supposedly fully realized masterwork, when actually what you've got sometimes what you get in construction, like you know, there's stuff that's not actually there behind the walls. You know, it's been spackled over, it's been given a coat of paint, or it's been given a really nice finish, but architecturally it's a bit flimsy. Yeah. And actually, when Kent Jones reviewed Magnolia in 1999, a review I think I cite in the book, but I've certainly kept in mind since reading it, is he says, you know, Anderson has an incredible sense of how movies feel to watch, but on infrastructure, he's a little fuzzy. And I think that one of the big turns for him is he's always had the goods as a director, and he's always had the force of will to get actors to do great stuff, and not in a micromanaging multiple take way, but more in like, you know, actors seem to respond to him and he has good instincts for actors. I mean, he found Philip Seymour Hoffman basically in Hard Eight, but more that as a writer, he either has a better sense of how to build these things conceptually and dramatically, you know, the dialogue, you know, has improved. And so even though in a way the master is so elliptical and threatening to break apart, and for some people is just completely incoherent. I mean, for some people, they can't get their head around the movie. But I see that movie first and foremost as a triumph of writing and structure, where it really is, I mean, as brilliantly edited as it is, I think the editing is there in the writing. I would not make this claim for Magnolia being a brilliantly written movie.
No.
It's half and half. It's half brilliantly written and half kind of bad. And, you know, I think the movie reflects that unevenness.
But so then, I mean, on the last note, like, I mean, this is not within the framework of your book, but what did and I was choked up when Twitter found this out for us. What did you feel when you noticed that Paul Thomas Anderson's new movie cast Hoffman's son?
I mean, how can you not be moved, right?
Yeah.
I have a friend, I mean, I won't name her, but one of my best friends was in Hoffman's theater company in New York. And she used to talk about him kind of just as Phil. And it wasn't over familiarity. It wasn't name dropping stories. It was like she was talking about a colleague, basically. And she said that, he could be, selfish and annoying and work people pretty hard. But she said that there was this absolute core of decency and kindness from him that didn't cancel out the ways which he was hurting himself, because it's pretty obvious now in retrospect what Philip Seymour Hoffman was going through in terms of addiction and self-harm, but that he never seemed to take it out on others. And you try not to romanticize actors, and I wouldn't even call Philip Seymour Hoffman a celebrity. He's a working actor. I don't think that he has the same fantasy space in people's minds that Heath Ledger does, right? Or that Kobe Bryant did. I mean, it's not the same.
Right.
But Hoffman's death for me was one of the most significant moments of loss I've ever felt, not in a personal way, like not as a friend or a family member, but just like, how is this person gone?
Right.
Because he's someone who even in movies I didn't like, or that I think were liable, I think were sometimes kind of not great movies, you just always wanted to see him. And it was reassuring to see him in movies because he was going to bring it. And so that combination of what I've heard about him firsthand as a person and what I experienced about him firsthand as a viewer, he's a big absence. In writing this book made me miss him because you're rewatching the films. So in a way, you're not missing him at all. I kind of overdosed on him. I watched Punch Drunk Love 3 times when I was writing that chapter. And I don't ever need to see Philip Seymour Hoffman saying, fuck again. I mean, that's enough. But yeah, when you find out that Anderson is making a coming of age movie and that he's put Hoffman's kid in it, it's ingenious, like in a detached way. You're like, that's smart, good casting. And on a, in terms of who this kid is, you're like, I hope it helps his career. But it's hard to not be moved because it's not just like taking an actor's kid and putting them in a movie the way Tarantino does in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood with Ethan Hawke's kid and Rumor Willis and all that. It's personal. It's a friendship thing. And I think that, I don't know, it's something as dumb as them both having 3 names, but Paul Thomas Anderson and Philip Seymour Hoffman were always seen as a sort of a package deal in a way, even though none of the movies are necessarily star vehicles for him. And I think lately he's kind of been supplanted by Daniel Day-Lewis in the sense of these guys are the pair. Right. And the 2 Day-Lewis movies are built so fully around him and his mystique as an actor. But that's a difference between, there's a lot of differences between Daniel Day-Lewis and Philip Seymour Hoffman. But Daniel Day-Lewis can't ever just be in something.
Right.
It got to the point by 2012 where the only way you could put him in a movie is he's Abraham Lincoln. I mean, unless they're going to make Jesus Christ the later years, it's a good thing he's going to stay retired because what else can he play?
Right.
When you look at Day-Lewis at the beginning of his career, he was just kind of in movies. He was an actor.
Yeah.
Now he's a fucking mountain. And Hoffman was never like that.
Right.
You could put him in literally look at Along Came Polly where he's playing pickup basketball with Ben Stiller shirtless. I mean, that's as much an Oscar movie for him as Charlie Wilson's War.
Right.
The guy could just show up in movies as a lead, as a supporting part, and counterpoint to the action. He is one of the greats for as far as I'm concerned.